What if the worst thing that ever happened to you wasn't being ignored? What if it wasn't being overlooked or being told that you weren't enough? What if the worst thing that ever happened to you was actually being told you were beautiful, being told you were everything, by a voice that slipped into your head so smoothly, so perfectly, that you didn't even notice it happening until it was far, far too late? Because here's what nobody talks about when they talk about this book. We are biologically wired to seek validation, but we rarely question the motive of the person handing it to us, or the psychological hook hidden inside the compliment, and that is exactly what most summaries of this book completely miss. Today we are doing a deep dive into Oscar Wilde's 1890 novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray. Now, the pop culture version of this story goes something like this. A guy gets his portrait painted, he somehow stays young and gorgeous forever while the painting gets old and ugly. He does a bunch of bad things, and then he dies. The end. Which is the plot, strictly speaking. But that surface level summary misses the actual engine of the story. It reduces a massively complex psychological thriller into a bedtime fable. Because what Oscar Wilde actually wrote here is a masterclass in psychological horror. It is a mirror held up to Victorian hypocrisy. It is an encrypted ledger of queer identity. And it is a cautionary tale about the terrifying, insidious power of influence. This is a text that operates on overlapping levels. You have the surface narrative, which is engaging enough on its own. Underneath it, there is a labyrinth of social critique, philosophical debate, and a deeply personal confession running just below the surface. The deeper you dig into the historical context, the more you realize that Wilde was essentially writing a bomb disguised as drawing room entertainment. And to give you a way to anchor this before we get into the weeds, think of the premise of this book like the modern digital age. Think of it like outsourcing your conscience to a perfectly curated, eternally flawless social media profile, while the real you, the actual human being, just decays behind closed doors where nobody can see. The horror of this novel isn't just about a magic painting, it is about the displacement of the self. It is about what happens when the consequences of your actions are entirely severed from your lived experience. When you no longer have to look at the damage you cause, what actually stops you from causing more? That is the big question. But before we can understand the monster, before we can understand Dorian Gray and the psychological trap he falls into, we have to understand the laboratory that created him. We have to look at the Victorian era, the incredibly contradictory, highly pressurized world of Victorian England. We are talking about the era from 1837 to 1901. And you really cannot separate the Picture of Dorian Gray from the era in which it was forged. The Victorian era was defined by a fiercely rigid code of values. The public narrative was entirely focused on duty, hard work, respectability, charity, and an intense emphasis on the family unit. It was an age completely obsessed with categorization and moral boundaries. Now, there is a concept from this period that our research highlights heavily, and it is worth unpacking. It is called the angel in the house. That phrase comes from a highly popular 1854 poem by Coventry Patmore, and it encapsulated the ideology of what historians call separate spheres. Men occupied the public sphere, business, politics, the aggressive outside world. Women, on the other hand, were relegated entirely to the private sphere, the home. A woman's perceived value in this society was intrinsically tied to her submission, her role as a wife and mother, and her supposed lack of sexual desire. She was meant to be a beacon of spiritual purity that the man could return to after engaging with the outside world. Men, by contrast, were viewed as naturally lustful and aggressive creatures who needed this domestic angel to keep their darker impulses in check, which sets up an enormous double standard right from the start. But the hypocrisy goes much deeper than gender rules, because the Industrial Revolution was happening at exactly the same time, and it fundamentally changed the human relationship with time itself. Before industrialization, in agrarian societies, work was task-oriented. You worked until the harvest was in, or the animals were fed. Your day was dictated by the sun and the seasons. But with the rise of industrialization, people moved in mass from the countryside to enormous urban centers like London, working in factories, clocking in and clocking out. No longer paid for the task, paid for the time. Which means for the first time on a mass scale, there was a distinct concept of leisure time. The weekend was born. The evening off became a real thing. And what happens when a massive population suddenly has designated leisure time? The entertainment industry explodes. And despite the rigid moral codes preached from pulpits every Sunday, the entertainment that Victorians actually consumed was highly sensational. This is the birth of scandal sheets, the direct ancestors of modern tabloids, filled with celebrity gossip and lurid crime stories. People flocked to freak shows and theatrical burlesques. There were massive melodramas with simulated waterfalls and train crashes staged live in theaters. There was an insatiable appetite for the grotesque and the scandalous. Now here is the thing. We always talk about the Victorians like they were uniquely hypocritical, but this is just the classic human condition. We demand moral perfection in public today, but we crave scandal and reality television in private. So how did the Victorians handle this massive cognitive dissonance without their entire society collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions? The answer is that the hypocrisy was not a glitch in the Victorian system. It was the feature that held it together. The rigid moral code was not necessarily meant to be followed flawlessly. It was meant to be displayed. Respectability was a mask, and it was heavily utilized by the expanding middle and upper classes to separate themselves from the poor, to distinguish themselves from the working classes. And here is how extreme that distinction was. Our research shows that somewhere between 70 and 80% of the population lived in extreme poverty, doing physically demanding manual labor. So how did the wealthy elite, living in absolute luxury off inherited lands and investments, justify that staggering inequality? By moralizing it. The upper classes often engaged in deeply unethical behavior behind closed doors, extramarital affairs, frequenting the brothels of the East End, visiting opium dens in the slums, living a total double life, but they excused their own behavior in private while publicly condemning the impoverished working class as the criminal class. Poverty was not viewed as an economic failure of the state. It was viewed as a moral failure of the individual. As long as you kept your scandals in the dark and your top hat clean in the light, society functioned. You could visit the opium dens at night, so long as you preached sobriety in the drawing room the next morning. It was a culture of intense compartmentalization, and the psychological toll of that compartmentalization was immense. Public discourse aggressively advocated for the suppression of sexual desire, while a massively thriving underground culture of pornography and prostitution existed just beneath the surface. The pressure of maintaining that facade had to be suffocating. The Victorian upper class was essentially living a collective double life. And eventually there was a group of artists and thinkers who looked at this society-wide performance of fake morality and said, "We are done. We are sick of wearing this mask," which sparks a massive cultural rebellion. And this is where we see the rise of the aesthetic movement and decadence, the exact philosophical soil from which the Picture of Dorian Gray grows. The aesthetes looked at all of that hypocrisy and decided that traditional morality was completely bankrupt. Our research highlights that this movement was a direct rejection of traditional Victorian art, going all the way back to the ancient Roman poet Horace. The prevailing Victorian belief was that art had to have a moral purpose. It was a tool for social education, for enlightenment. You read a book to learn how to be a better, more moral citizen. Think of writers like Charles Dickens or George Gissing. Their work shone a light on social ills, orphans and workhouses, the struggles of the working poor. Work designed to evoke sympathy and inspire social reform. That was the accepted, respectable function of art. It was utilitarian, but the aesthetic movement, heavily influenced by French writers like Charles Baudelaire and Gustave Flaubert, fundamentally rejected that obligation. And this is where we get that famous French phrase, l'art pour l'art, art for art's sake, promoted in Britain by figures like Walter Pater in his influential work, Studies in the History of the Renaissance. The estates argued that a piece of art has absolutely no duty to be moral, no duty to teach you a lesson or improve society. Its only duty, its only metric of success, is to be beautiful and to evoke pleasure. Think of it this way. Traditional Victorian art was treated like a broccoli podcast. You consume it because society tells you it is good for you. It builds character. It gives you intellectual nutrients. The aesthetic movement comes along and says, no, art is pure, unadulterated dessert. It does not need to give you vitamins. It just needs to taste incredible. And the Victorian establishment thought that serving nothing but dessert would rot the moral teeth of society. To value form, craftsmanship, and sensual pleasure over moral instruction was not just frivolous to them, it was perceived as actively dangerous, because it threatened the entire fabric of the social order. If people started chasing pleasure instead of duty, who would run the empire? Who would maintain the rigid social hierarchy? And Oscar Wilde was the absolute poster child for this movement. Our research points to the preface he wrote for the Picture of Dorian Gray, which he actually added a year after the initial publication, because the first reviews called the story immoral, vulgar, and literally poisonous. And in that preface, he drops this absolute bomb. He writes that there is no such thing as a moral or an immoral book. Books are well written or badly written, that is all. It was a philosophical declaration of independence for the artist. But Wilde was not saying that art has no relationship to society. In his essays, like The English Renaissance of Art, he argued that by keeping aloof from the social problems of the day, art actually acts as a kind of reverse mirror. Now here is how that works. By not preaching to us, by simply presenting absolute, unachievable beauty, art highlights the massive gap between the ideal and our actual reality. As Wilde put it, to most of us, the real life is the life we do not lead. Art shows us the beauty, the freedom, the uninhibited existence that our societal rules actively deny us. It makes us acutely aware of our own deprivation. It shows you the life you could have if you were not trapped in the Victorian machine. So with this intense war between rigid hypocritical morality and the rebellious pursuit of pure beauty fully established, we can step into Basil Hallward's art studio. This is where the story begins. And this is where we meet the three men who embody this entire philosophical war, the central trio of the novel, Basil Hallward, Lord Henry Wotton, and Dorian Gray. Now it is vital to view them not just as characters interacting in a room, but almost as psychological archetypes, competing fragments of a single mind. Wilde himself once stated that Basil is who he thinks he is, Lord Henry is who the world thinks he is, and Dorian is who he would like to be. Let's start with Basil Hallward. He is the painter, the creator, a deeply moral man who has become utterly obsessively infatuated with his new muse, Dorian Gray. Basil tells Lord Henry that he can never actually exhibit this portrait he is painting. He is afraid the world will see his true feelings. His affection and worship of Dorian, revealed in the brushstrokes, and sitting in the studio with him is Lord Henry Wotton, the aristocrat, the philosopher, the ultimate cynic, the decadent dandy. Our research describes him as espousing a philosophy of self-indulgent hedonism. If Basil is the moral creator, Lord Henry is the corrupting influence, and into this room walks Dorian Gray himself, the subject of the painting, young, incredibly wealthy, breathtakingly handsome, and completely unformed. That is the key to the entire tragedy. When we meet Dorian, he is a blank slate, naive. He does not truly understand his own power or his own identity. He is essentially clay waiting to be molded. And Lord Henry immediately recognizes this vulnerability. Now, when you read most summaries, Lord Henry is always painted as the villain, the corrupter. But the man never actually does anything wrong himself. He just sits around smoking cigarettes and dropping witty, cynical observations. He never physically harms anyone. He never forces Dorian to do a single thing. So is Lord Henry really the devil on Dorian's shoulder? Or is he the Victorian equivalent of someone posting highly controversial opinions online and then acting completely shocked when someone actually acts on them in the real world? This is one of the major debates within the text. Lord Henry is physically entirely inactive. As Basil tells him in the novel, you never say a moral thing and you never do a wrong thing. Lord Henry prefers to study life with scientific detachment. He views other people's lives as his entertainment, and his most terrifying trait is a total, absolute indifference to consequences. He treats Dorian like a psychological experiment. He wants to see what happens if you pour toxic ideas into a pristine vessel. While Dorian sits with the portrait, Lord Henry starts talking. He targets the very foundation of Dorian's unformed identity. He gives Dorian the vocabulary to realize that his youth and his beauty are his only true currencies, and then he delivers the fatal blow. He warns Dorian that these currencies are fleeting, that every passing day brings him closer to being old, irrelevant, forgotten. He tells him to live fully, to yield to every temptation before the season of his youth expires. It is a masterful manipulation. He creates a panic, a sense of absolute scarcity, where a moment ago there was only innocence, and this sudden terrifying awareness of his own mortality triggers the most famous Faustian bargain in all of literature. When Basil finishes the portrait, Dorian looks at it and for the first time truly sees himself through the lens Lord Henry has just provided. He sees perfection that will last forever on the canvas, while he himself is doomed to decay. The painting becomes a taunt, so he makes the wish. He says he would give everything, even his own soul, if the arrangement could be reversed, if the painting could grow old, and he could stay young forever, and the wish is granted. But here is where the popular understanding of this story often gets it wrong. It is not a bargain for eternal life. Dorian does not become immortal. He can still be killed. He simply stops aging physically. His body becomes a static, unchanging shell of perfect youth, while the portrait becomes the living, breathing, decaying record of his life and his soul. It is a deeply unsettling psychological horror story about what happens when you outsource your conscience to an outside entity. When the portrait takes on the burden of recording Dorian's aging and his sins, Dorian is effectively liberated from the visible consequences of his actions, but he is also severed from his own moral compass. The portrait becomes his conscience, hidden away in a locked room. And with his conscience locked in the attic, his entire operating system is rewritten by Lord Henry's philosophy. Our research pulls a quote from Henry that is genuinely chilling. He tells Dorian that the only way to get rid of a temptation is to yield to it, because if you resist it, your soul grows sick with longing for the things it has forbidden itself. It is the ultimate intellectual justification for unchecked hedonism. It dresses up selfishness as a form of spiritual hygiene. And Lord Henry supercharges this influence by giving Dorian a book. It is referred to in the novel as the poisonous yellow book. Our research tells us this was heavily modelled after a real French novel by Joris Karl Huysmans called A Rebels, or Against Nature. That novel features an aristocratic protagonist named Desatzintes who secludes himself entirely from society. He surrounds himself with exotic perfumes, rare books, and intense sensory experiences, trying to construct an entirely artificial aesthetic world, an existence built purely on artifice, and it eventually destroys his physical and mental health. Dorian uses this book as his dark guidebook. It becomes the template for his entire existence, and to bring it back to the modern day, think of it like this. Dorian is a young, impressionable person who is handed a device by Lord Henry, and that device has an algorithm perfectly tuned to feed him extreme, radicalizing, hedonist content. It starts with mild aesthetic pleasures, but the algorithm needs engagement, so it pushes him toward darker, more extreme sensory experiences, and Basil is the helpless witness, watching his creation completely mutate, entirely powerless to stop the code that Lord Henry installed in Dorian's mind. The tragedy of Dorian Gray is not just that he becomes cruel, it is that he was made to love himself by someone else. As our research notes, Dorian pursues life not as an active, original agent, but as a disciple. Living out Lord Henry's theories, he loses his agency. He adopts a philosophy of treating life purely as a collection of aesthetic experiences, whether they are sweet or bitter. He becomes a consumer of life rather than a participant in it, collecting sensations the way a child collects insects in a jar. And because he is seeking sensation over genuine connection, his empathy completely atrophies. Other human beings cease to be people to him. They become instruments to provide him with new experiences or aesthetic pleasure, which sets up the very first and incredibly fatal casualty of this new operating system, Sibyl Vane, and the death of art, because this is where the philosophy turns into real-world tragedy. Sibyl Vane is a young, beautiful, talented, but impoverished actress. Dorian discovers her performing Shakespeare in a dingy theatre in the slums of London. The contrast is vital. The theatre is squalid, reeking of cheap gas lamps and unwashed bodies. But on that stage, Sibyl is delivering the pristine, transcendent verse of Shakespeare with a conviction that takes Dorian's breath away. But here is the thing. Dorian is not captivated by her. He is captivated by the characters she plays. He tells Lord Henry, tonight she is Rosalind, and tomorrow night she will be Juliet. And Henry asks, when is she Sibyl Vane? And Dorian replies, never. He does not even view her as a human being. She calls him Prince Charming, because she does not even know his real name. He never gave it to her. This dynamic perfectly illustrates the danger of the aesthetic ideal taken to its extreme. Dorian does not love Sibyl, he loves her artifice. He loves her ability to embody the great heroines of literature. And within the framework of the queer Gothic hero's journey, which research from the University of Southern Mississippi explores in depth, Sibyl represents what scholars call the goddess figure. Now let's unpack what the queer Gothic hero's journey actually is. Because it is very different from the standard hero's journey most of us are familiar with from stories like Star Wars or Lord of the Rings. In the traditional hero's journey, the hero ventures into the unknown, faces trials, achieves a victory, and then crucially returns to their society to share a newfound wisdom that heals the community. Think of bringing the magic sword back to save the village. The queer Gothic hero's journey subverts this completely. Because the hero's true identity is criminalized or marginalized by society, their journey is not about saving the community. It is a descent into transgression, isolation, and often self-destruction. The initiation phase involves breaking societal taboos, and in this framework, Sibyl Vane is the goddess figure Dorian encounters during that initiation. Her acting is a cyclical process of life and death. She is born as Juliet, dies, and is reborn as Rosalind the next night. She represents the pure realm of art, but then reality intrudes. Sibyl actually falls in love with the real Dorian, and because she now knows true, genuine emotion, she can no longer effectively fake it on stage. Her acting becomes wooden, hollow. She loses her artifice because she has found reality. Dorian brings Basil and Lord Henry to see her perform, and she is completely unconvincing. She embarrasses him in front of his mentors, and Dorian's reaction is swift, brutal, and entirely devoid of empathy. He goes backstage and tells her that without her art she is nothing. He abandons her on the spot. Because he views life exclusively through the lens of extreme aestheticism, the moment Sibyl steps out of the realm of art and into messy, unpolished reality, her value to him drops to zero. He did not love a human being at all. He was essentially in love with a performance, and the absolute second the quality of that performance dropped, he cancelled it without a second thought. He consumed her performances, and when they ceased to provide pleasure, he discarded the source entirely. The consequence of that discard is devastating. Sibyl takes her own life. She drinks poison in her dressing room, and Dorian is initially shocked, perhaps even a little guilty. But then Lord Henry steps in to do what he does best. He manipulates the narrative. Lord Henry immediately reframes the tragedy. He tells Dorian not to grieve over Sibyl Vane. He repackages her suicide as a beautiful dramatic spectacle. He tells Dorian it has all the terrible beauty of a Greek tragedy, a tragedy in which Dorian took a great part but by which he was not wounded. He literally edits the trauma out of the experience. He turns a real woman's death into a piece of art for Dorian to passively appreciate. And Dorian accepts this framing eagerly. He tells Henry that it seems to him simply like a wonderful ending to a wonderful play. He feels no moral responsibility whatsoever. And this specific moment, this total failure of empathy, this conscious choice of aesthetic pleasure over human morality, marks the very first time the portrait changes. He goes home, looks at the painting Basil gave him, and sees a new expression on the face, a touch of cruelty around the mouth. The canvas has begun to record his sins. Now this brings us to a fascinating concept that our research highlights. What did the Victorians actually believe about the relationship between how you look and who you are? In the 19th century, there was a deeply held, pervasive belief in pseudosciences like phrenology and physiognomy. Physiognomy was the idea that a person's moral character, their inner soul, is visibly and physically reflected in their facial features, their bone structure, their outward appearance. Ugliness equals evil. Beauty equals goodness. If someone was a criminal, the Victorians believed you could literally see it in the shape of their jaw, the asymmetry of their face, the heaviness of their brow. Think of Cesare Lombroso, who tried to catalogue the physical traits of what he called born criminals. And conversely, if someone was breathtakingly beautiful, like Dorian Gray, society subconsciously assumed they must be inherently pure, innocent, and morally upright. And we still do this today. When we see someone incredibly attractive on social media, we subconsciously assume they have their life together. We assume they are happier, smarter, kinder. Psychologists call it the halo effect. The Victorians just turned that psychological bias into a rigid pseudoscience. So if Victorian society genuinely believed that bad people physically looked bad, Dorian is essentially a walking glitch in their entire moral system. He possesses the ultimate weaponized version of what we would today call pretty privilege. As the years pass, Dorian engages in increasingly depraved acts. Rumors swirl about him in London society. Whispers of ruined lives, young men who end up disgraced or dead after associating with him, scandals in underground gambling dens. But whenever people actually confront him, they look at his face, which remains as flawless and innocent as a 20-year-old boy, and they simply cannot bring themselves to believe the rumors. The text explicitly states that he had always the look of one who had kept himself unspotted from the world. His physical beauty acts as an impenetrable shield against social judgment. While upstairs, locked in the attic, the portrait is becoming the true physiognomic ledger. Every lie, every cruelty, every selfish act adds a twisted smile, a new wrinkle, a look of madness to the painted face. It is becoming a decaying, rotting record of everything he refuses to feel. This creates a profound duality in the novel. The written narrative tells the story of a charming, beautiful young man navigating high society, but Wilde's vivid literary descriptions of the painting tell the true hidden story of a corrupted soul. The portrait is the real Dorian. The walking, talking man is just a beautiful mask, which forces us to confront the grand philosophical debate at the heart of this novel. Did Oscar Wilde write this book to promote the aesthetic lifestyle, to say, look how liberating it is to be a hedonist? Or did he write it to tear that exact philosophy apart? Research from Boston University, in an essay by Patrick Duggan, makes a highly compelling argument. On the surface, the novel seems to champion Lord Henry's aesthetic lifestyle. It's full of witty, epigrammatic dialogue defending pleasure and beauty. But Duggan argues that the Picture of Dorian Gray actually serves as a severe, devastating critique of uncontrolled aestheticism and hedonism. Because Dorian's pursuit of pleasure does not lead to happiness, it leads to utter isolation and destruction. Duggan connects Dorian's fate to the Greek myth of Narcissus. Narcissus, who fell so deeply in love with his own reflection in a pool of water that he could not tear himself away, and eventually wasted away staring at himself. By becoming entirely self-absorbed in his pursuit of sensory pleasure, the rest of the world effectively ceases to exist for Dorian, except as tools for his amusement. He isolates himself completely from genuine human connection, and he becomes a black hole of influence himself. He takes what Lord Henry did to him and amplifies it. We see him corrupting those around him. Adrian Singleton, a young man Dorian introduces to vice, who ends up forging a check and becoming a total outcast. Alan Campbell, a brilliant chemist whose life is eventually destroyed by his association with Dorian. Dorian moves through London in disguise, visiting the foulest opium dens, ruining everyone he touches. Now here is where it gets interesting. Oscar Wilde, the man who stood in velvet suits preaching art for art's sake, the ultimate decadent, actually wrote what reads like a morality tale. Doesn't that completely contradict his own famous preface, where he boldly stated there is no such thing as a moral or immoral book? It seems contradictory on the surface, but this is where the analysis gets genuinely sophisticated. The research connects Wilde's ultimate message to Matthew Arnold's cultural theories, laid out in his famous essay, Culture and Anarchy. Arnold defines culture as the pursuit of total human perfection. He called it seeking sweetness and light, intellectual and moral beauty held in balance. On the other end of the spectrum, he defines anarchy as the dangerous tendency of individuals to simply do as one likes. Anarchy is unchecked individualism without any guiding moral framework. Think of a playground with no rules, where every child does exactly what they want at all times. At first it seems like ultimate freedom, but very quickly people get hurt, and the playground descends into chaos. Emphasizes this by showing that pure, unbridled aestheticism, acting on every single impulse, doing strictly as one likes, without any consideration for others, is a form of Arnoldian anarchy. It inevitably becomes hostile to morality. It is the difference between appreciating a beautiful fire in a fireplace and letting that fire burn your entire house down because you like the way the flames look. If you completely divorce your actions from their consequences, it leads to self-destruction. Wilde actually admitted this himself in a letter to the St. James's Gazette. He wrote that all excess, as well as all renunciation, brings its own punishment. He was warning against the extremism of the very philosophy he was publicly associated with. Dorian Gray is a case study of aestheticism practiced without prudence or empathy. So the painting is a metaphor for the destructive nature of unchecked hedonism. But our research points to another reason, a much more dangerous and deeply personal reason, why Wilde had to displace the sins and desires of his characters onto a hidden canvas. It was not just a philosophical metaphor, it was a shield for his own survival. We have to look at the reality of 1885, just a few years before the novel was published. The British government passed the Criminal Law Amendment Act, specifically what became known as the Labouchere Amendment. This act legally criminalized all homosexual acts between men, whether in public or in private, labeling them as gross indecency. This was not just a social taboo, it was a jailable offense. It meant hard labor. It meant total social, financial, and personal ruin. You could be blackmailed, extorted, or imprisoned simply for being who you were. Oscar Wilde, as a man who experienced same-sex attraction, was living in a society that actively sought to imprison him for his identity. Expressing homoerotic desire publicly, even in literature, was incredibly dangerous. When Wilde first submitted the manuscript of Dorian Gray to Lippincott's monthly magazine, it was considered one of the most explicit representations of homoerotic desire in English literature up to that point. The editor censored and toned down parts of it before publication. Wilde toned it down even further for the 1891 book edition. But even toned down, the novel is heavily coded. Our research points out that women are largely excluded from the emotional core of the book. Vane is there, but Dorian's feeling for her is fleeting, entirely performative and based on artifice. The core emotional, passionate, and ultimately destructive relationships in this novel are entirely between men. Look at Basil Hallward. His infatuation with Dorian goes far beyond artistic appreciation. He says that Dorian's personality will absorb his whole nature, his whole soul, his very art itself. He admits that he put too much of himself into the painting because expressing this desire explicitly and acting upon it meant imprisonment. The portrait acts as the only safe, silent space for queer expression. Think of the painting as an encrypted file. In the real world, in the drawing rooms and the gentlemen's clubs, Basil, Lord Henry, and Dorian have to play by strict Victorian rules. They have to wear the mask of respectability. But on that canvas, all the suppressed truths, the forbidden desires, the authentic identities are loudly present. It is the only place the truth can exist without the threat of a prison cell. And this raises a profoundly tragic element embedded in the narrative. The painting does not just hold the visual record of Dorian's hedonism, it holds the immense shame, guilt, and fear that society forcibly projected onto anyone who did not conform. Dorian's intense, paranoid fear of the portrait being discovered is not just about his crimes being found out. It mirrors the very real, waking terror of a closeted Victorian living a double life. The sheer panic that someone will look past the respectable public mask and see the criminal underneath. The painting is the closet. It is a brilliant, devastating displacement of the anxieties of living in a deeply oppressive society. Wilde utilizes the Gothic trope of the secret monster hidden away, like the wife locked in the attic in Jane Eyre, or Dr. Jekyll's alter ego Mr. Hyde. But the monster in Wilde's novel is, in part, the identity that society itself has criminalized. The weight of this double life, both for the fictional Dorian Gray and for the very real Oscar Wilde, eventually reaches an absolute breaking point. Years pass, Dorian is nearly 40 years old, though he still looks 20, but the psychological toll of his double life, the paranoia of hiding the portrait, has driven him to the edge of madness. He decides to finally show the rotting, monstrous portrait to the man who painted it, Basil Hallward. Basil sees the painting, and he is horrified. He sees what his beautiful muse has become. The canvas is covered in corruption and decay. Basil begs Dorian to pray for forgiveness, to repent, to find a way back. And Dorian's reaction is explosive. In a fit of uncontrollable rage, Dorian grabs a knife and murders Basil right there in the room with the painting. Notice the symbolism of that act. He murders his creator. He murders the man who loved him purely, the man who represents traditional morality and conscience. It is the ultimate rejection of his own humanity. After the murder, Dorian blackmails his former friend, the brilliant chemist Alan Campbell. He forces Campbell to use his scientific knowledge to dispose of Basil's body using nitric acid, completely erasing the physical evidence of the crime. He literally dissolves the evidence of his conscience, but he cannot erase the painting. The painting is the only remaining witness to his true self, and now the blood of Basil is literally present in the hands of the figure on the canvas. So Dorian decides he has to destroy it. He believes that if he destroys the painting, he will sever his tie to the past and finally be free. He takes the exact same knife he used to kill Basil, and he stabs the canvas. And this is where the duality of the portrait and the man collapses in on itself with brutal finality. By attempting to kill the representation of his soul, Dorian effectively kills himself. The magic is broken. The servants hear a horrific cry and a crash. When they finally break into the locked room, they find the painting hanging on the wall, completely restored to its flawless, innocent, youthful beauty. And on the floor, a withered, decrepit, hideous old man with a knife through his heart. The servants do not even recognize him. The text says they identify the body as Dorian Gray only by the rings on his fingers. Now pause on that detail for a moment. He pursued incredible sensory experiences. He lived a wildly extreme life. He destroyed people. He collected rare jewels and ancient tapestries and exquisite perfumes. And in the end, the only proof that he ever existed is his jewelry. The rings represent the absolute pinnacle of superficiality. Dorian's physical death perfectly mirrors the intellectual and moral death that comes from living a purely surface-level existence. He valued the material over the spiritual. He traded his soul for eternal appearances. And in the end, only the decorative, material accessories remained to prove he was ever there. His internal self was completely hollowed out and destroyed by his own choices. Now the real-world parallel here cannot be ignored. Wilde wrote this book holding a mirror up to his oppressive, hypocritical society. He showed them their own ugliness, their own double standards, their own cruelties hidden behind respectable drawing room doors. And just like Dorian lashing out and destroying the mirror that showed him his true self, Victorian society lashed out at Oscar Wilde. A few years after the publication of this novel, Wilde was put on trial for gross indecency, And during that trial, excerpts from the Picture of Dorian Gray were actually read aloud in court and used against him as evidence of his immoral character. The book he wrote became a weapon used to destroy him. He was publicly humiliated, stripped of his wealth, separated from his children, and sentenced to 2 years of hard labor in prison. The system broke his health. He died in exile in Paris at the age of 46. Society destroyed the artist for having the audacity to show them the truth. So let's bring this all the way home. We started in the thick smoke and deep hypocrisy of Victorian London, where respectability was a mask worn over secret vices. We climbed the rebellious intellectual heights of the aesthetic movement with its battle cry of art for art's sake. We stepped into the terrifying psychological trap of the Faustian bargain, watching a young man hand his conscience over to the influence of an outside voice. And we explored the heavy, heartbreaking burden of queer identity hidden inside a Gothic masterpiece. This is a text that truly rewards deep attention. It challenges us to examine the masks we wear, the rationalizations we make, and the influences we allow into our mind. It asks us what happens when we consistently prioritize the aesthetic over the ethical. And the warnings in this novel are not ancient history. They are violently relevant right now. We are living in an age of digital avatars, of algorithmic influence, of carefully curated online lives where the superficial is constantly and aggressively prioritized over the substantive. We are all in some way curating our own portraits for the world to see, filtering out our flaws and our failures, while our actual messy human lives happen behind the screen. The mechanisms of influence have evolved from drawing room conversations to digital feeds, but human nature has not changed. We are still susceptible to the Lord Henrys of the world. Those voices, those algorithms, those trends that quietly and persistently tell us what to value, what to desire, and what to discard. So here is the final thought I want to leave you with. We all have a public face we show the world, and we all consume content that invisibly rewrites our operating system, shaping what we want, what we fear, and what we are willing to do to protect the image we have built. If a painter were to magically capture the exact state of your inner world today, shaped by every influence you have let in, every piece of content you have consumed, every value you hold in secret rather than in public, what would your portrait look like? And more importantly, would you be brave enough to look at it?